The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Silver Creek, a small frontier town nestled between rolling hills and vast stretches of untamed wilderness. The year was 1887, and the scent of coal smoke mixed with the aroma of fresh bread from the bakery on Main Street. Horse-drawn carriages rattled over wooden planks, their wheels creating a rhythmic melody that had become the heartbeat of this growing settlement. Among the bustling crowd of merchants, farmers, and travelers, a young woman moved with quiet grace, her head held high despite the whispers that followed her every step. Ayanna Whitehorse was 22 years old, with striking features that revealed her mixed heritage. Her father had been Cherokee, a proud warrior who had fought to protect his people's land before the forced relocations. Her mother was a white woman from the East, a teacher who had come to work with Native children, and had fallen in love with a man whose world was so different from her own. Ayanna's dark hair was braided simply and tucked beneath a worn but clean bonnet. Her dress, though patched in places, was pressed and modest. She carried herself with dignity that seemed to anger some of the townspeople, as if they believed her mixed blood should make her bow her head in shame. Her copper-toned skin and high cheekbones marked her as different in a town where difference was often met with suspicion and cruelty. She worked as a maid for the Thornfield family, one of the wealthiest households in Silver Creek. Edmund Thornfield owned the largest ranch in the territory, and his wife Margaret considered herself the social queen of their small community. The Thornfield mansion sat on a hill overlooking the town, its white columns and wraparound porch a symbol of prosperity in an otherwise modest settlement. Ayanna had been working for the Thornfields for 3 years, ever since her mother had died of tuberculosis and left her truly alone in the world. Her father had been killed when she was just 16, shot by a drunken ranch hand who claimed the Cherokee man had been stealing cattle. No charges were ever filed, and the killer had moved on to another town, leaving Ayanna to fend for herself. The work was hard, but Ayanna was grateful to have employment and a small room in the servants' quarters where she could sleep safely. She cleaned the large house from top to bottom, tended the garden, helped in the kitchen, and performed countless other duties that kept the Thornfield household running smoothly. Margaret Thornfield was demanding and often cruel with her words, but Edmund seemed kinder, though he rarely spoke to the help directly. This particular morning, Ayanna was walking to the general store to purchase supplies for the household. Mrs. Thornfield had given her a long list and specific instructions about what to buy and how much to spend. As always, Ayanna carried the money carefully in a small cloth pouch tucked securely inside her dress pocket. The general store was busy with the usual morning crowd, farmers discussing crop prices, women comparing fabric samples, and children peering longingly at penny candy behind glass jars. When Ayanna entered, the cheerful chatter seemed to dim slightly. She was used to this reaction and had learned to ignore it, focusing instead on her tasks. She moved through the store methodically, gathering flour, sugar, coffee, and the other items on her list. The storekeeper, Mr. Hanson, was a fair man who treated her with basic courtesy, unlike some of the other merchants in town. As she collected her purchases, she noticed a group of young men near the front of the store. They were roughly dressed ranch hands, probably in town for supplies and entertainment after a long week of work. One of them, a tall man with unwashed hair and clothes that reeked of whiskey even at this early hour, kept staring at her with an expression that made her uncomfortable. She had seen him before around town and had always made sure to avoid him. His name was Jake Morrison, and he had a reputation for causing trouble, especially when he had been drinking. As Ayanna approached the counter to pay for her purchases, Morrison stepped in her path. His friends gathered around him, grinning in anticipation of whatever entertainment he might provide. "Well, Morrison said loudly, his voice carrying across the store and causing conversations to stop. "Look what we have here. The half-breed thinks she can shop with decent white folk." Ayanna kept her eyes down and tried to step around him, but he moved to block her again. "Excuse me, sir," she said quietly. "I need to pay for these items and return to my duties." Morrison laughed harshly. "Your duties? You mean serving your betters like a good little savage should." He looked around at the other customers, clearly enjoying the attention. "Isn't that right, folks? These people need to remember their place." The store had gone completely silent now. Some customers looked uncomfortable, but said nothing. Others watched with interest, as if Morrison was putting on a show for their entertainment. Mr. Hanson looked worried, but seemed unsure how to intervene without causing more trouble. "I'm not looking for any problems," Ayanna said, her voice steady despite the fear growing in her chest. "Please let me pass." But Morrison was just getting started. The whiskey from the night before was still in his system, and he had an audience that seemed willing to let him continue. "You know what I heard?" he said, stepping closer to her. "I heard your daddy was one of them Cherokee that used to raid white settlements. Probably killed good Christian folk before the army put him in his place." Ayanna's hands tightened on her basket, but she kept her voice level. "My father was a peaceful man. He never harmed anyone." "That's not what I heard," Morrison continued, his voice getting louder and more aggressive. "And your mama? She was just a race traitor who betrayed her own kind to lay with a savage. No wonder you turned out wrong." The words hit Ayanna like physical blows, but she refused to let him see how much they hurt. She had heard similar insults countless times before, but they never stopped stinging. Her parents had loved each other deeply, and their marriage had been one of the few bright spots in a world that seemed determined to tear apart anyone who didn't fit neatly into expected categories. "You don't know anything about my parents," she said, lifting her chin slightly. "They were good people who harmed no one." This show of defiance seemed to anger Morrison even more. "Good people," he sneered. "Your kind don't know what good means. You're all thieves and murderers, and those that aren't are just pretending to be civilized." He reached out and knocked the basket from her hands, sending her carefully selected purchases scattering across the wooden floor. Flowers spilled from its bag, creating a white cloud, and eggs cracked against the boards, their yellow contents spreading in sticky puddles. "Oops," Morrison said with mock concern. "Looks like the half-breed made a mess. Better clean it up like the good little maid you are." Ayanna knelt to gather the scattered items, trying to salvage what she could. Her face burned with humiliation, but she knew that any response would only make things worse. She had learned long ago that the best survival strategy was to endure whatever cruelty came her way and wait for it to pass. But Morrison wasn't finished with her. As she knelt on the floor, he placed his boot on her hand, pressing down just enough to cause pain without breaking bones. "I don't think you heard me, girl. I said clean up your mess." "She's cleaning up," said a voice from near the counter. It was Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who occasionally showed Ayanna small kindnesses. "Leave the child be, Jake Morrison. You've had your fun." Morrison turned his attention to the older woman. "This ain't your concern, Mrs. Patterson. This half-breed needs to learn some respect." "The only one showing disrespect here is you," Mrs. Patterson said firmly. "Your mother would be ashamed to see how you're behaving." For a moment, Morrison looked uncertain, but his friends laughed and encouraged him to continue. The peer pressure and lingering alcohol made him double down on his cruelty. "My mother would understand that some people need to be put in their place," he said. He turned back to Ayanna, who was still trying to clean up the spilled goods. Without warning, he grabbed her arm and yanked her to her feet. "I think you need to learn a lesson about showing proper respect to your betters." Ayanna tried to pull away from his grip, but he was much stronger than she was. "Please," she said, "I haven't done anything wrong. I just want to buy supplies and go home." "Home?" Morrison laughed. "You don't have a home, half-breed. You got a corner where white folks let you sleep in exchange for doing their dirty work. That's not a home. That's charity." The words stung because there was truth in them. Ayanna did feel homeless most of the time, caught between two worlds and fully accepted by neither. But she had worked hard to build some small sense of security and dignity in her life, and she wouldn't let this man take that away from her. "I pay my own way," she said quietly. "I work for what I have. You take what white folks give you," Morrison corrected her harshly, "and you better remember to be grateful for it." The confrontation was drawing attention from people outside the store now. A small crowd had gathered near the windows and doorway, watching the scene unfold. Some looked disgusted by Morrison's behavior, but others seemed to approve or at least find it entertaining. Ayanna noticed that among the watchers was Dr. Williams, the town physician, and his wife. Dr. Williams had always been kind to her, treating her with the same courtesy he showed his white patients. She caught his eye and saw concern there, but also helplessness. As a newcomer to the town, he probably felt he couldn't intervene without damaging his own standing in the community. Morrison seemed to feed off the attention from the crowd. He tightened his grip on Ayanna's arm and raised his other hand as if to strike her. Maybe a good slap will teach you some manners, he said. But before he could follow through on his threat, the store door opened and Edmund Thornfield walked in. The crowd immediately began to disperse, not wanting to be associated with the ugly scene that had been unfolding. Morrison's friends suddenly found other things to look at, and even Morrison himself seemed to deflate slightly. Thornfield was a tall, distinguished man in his 50s with graying hair and the kind of presence that commanded respect. He owned more land and employed more people than anyone else in the territory, which gave him considerable influence. His eyes quickly took in the scene: the spilled goods on the floor, Morrison's grip on Ayana's arm, and the uncomfortable expressions of the other customers. "What's going on here?" Thornfield asked, his voice calm, but carrying an undertone of authority. Morrison released Ayana's arm, but tried to maintain his aggressive posture. "Just teaching this half-breed some manners, Mr. Thornfield. She was being disrespectful." Thornfield looked at Ayana, who was trying to make herself as small as possible. "Is that true, Ayana? Were you being disrespectful?" "No, sir," she said quietly. "I was just trying to buy supplies for Mrs. Thornfield, like she asked me to do." "She's lying," Morrison said quickly. "These people always lie when they get caught misbehaving." Thornfield studied Morrison for a long moment. "I've known Ayana for 3 years," he said finally. "She's never been anything but respectful and hardworking. On the other hand, Jake, you've been in trouble for fighting and drinking more times than I can count." Morrison's face reddened with anger and embarrassment. "You're taking the word of a half-breed over a white man." "I'm taking the word of an honest person over a troublemaker," Thornfield replied calmly. "Ayana works for me, and I won't have my employees harassed while they're running errands." The dismissal in Thornfield's voice was clear, and Morrison realized he had lost this confrontation. But rather than backing down gracefully, his anger and humiliation made him lash out even more viciously. "This whole town's going soft," he snarled. "Pretty soon we'll be bowing down to every savage that wanders through here. Mark my words, people like her are going to be the ruin of decent white society." He turned to leave, but as he passed Ayana, he deliberately bumped into her hard enough to send her stumbling backward. She caught herself against a shelf, causing several items to fall to the floor. "Watch where you're standing, breed," Morrison said with a nasty grin. That was the final straw for several people in the store. Dr. Williams stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "That's enough, Morrison. You're behaving like an animal." "Stay out of this, Doc," Morrison warned. "Unless you want to join the half-breed on the floor." "Are you threatening me?" Dr. Williams asked incredulously. The tension in the store was becoming dangerous. Morrison's friends were looking nervous, realizing that their companion was escalating the situation beyond what they were comfortable with. Even they didn't want to get into a physical confrontation with the town's doctor and most prominent rancher. But Morrison was too angry and drunk to think clearly. "I'm just saying that people need to remember their place," he said. "And anyone who forgets that might need a reminder." Thornfield stepped closer to Morrison, using his height and presence to full advantage. "Jake, I think you need to leave. Now, before you say or do something you'll really regret." For a moment, it seemed like Morrison might back down. But then he looked around at all the faces watching him, and his pride wouldn't let him retreat. "I'll leave when I'm good and ready," he said, "and not before I finish what I started." He turned back toward Ayana, his intentions clear. But as he reached for her again, something unexpected happened. The store door opened, and 3 men walked in. Men whose presence immediately changed the entire atmosphere of the confrontation. They were Apache warriors, dressed in traditional clothing, but carrying modern weapons. Their faces were painted for travel, and their eyes were alert and dangerous. The leader was a man of perhaps 40 years, tall and powerfully built, with intelligence and authority radiating from every movement. The store went completely silent. Even Morrison froze, his hand still extended toward Ayana, but no longer moving. The Apache warriors looked around the room, taking in the scene with sharp, calculating eyes. The leader's gaze settled on Ayana, noting her distress and the obvious hostility in the room. Then, he looked at Morrison, still standing in a threatening posture over a young woman who was clearly of native heritage. In fluent English, the Apache chief spoke. "Is there a problem here?" His voice was quiet, but it carried the kind of authority that made everyone in the room pay attention. Morrison, despite his earlier bravado, seemed to shrink under the steady gaze of the 3 warriors. No problem, Thornfield said quickly, stepping forward. Just a misunderstanding that's being resolved. The Apache leader nodded slowly, but his eyes never left Morrison. I see. And this man was resolving the misunderstanding by threatening a young woman. Morrison finally found his voice. This ain't your concern, Indian. This is white folks' business. The words seemed to echo in the silent store, and everyone held their breath. The Apache warriors exchanged glances, and the tension in the room became almost unbearable. The leader smiled slightly, but there was no humor in it. Everything that happens in Apache territory is our concern, he said softly. And the way I see it, you were about to strike someone who couldn't defend herself. Where I come from, that makes you either a coward or a bully. Possibly both. Morrison's face went white, then red, then white again. He was caught between his ingrained prejudices, his angry pride, and the very real danger of provoking 3 armed warriors who had just called him a coward in front of the entire town. The confrontation hung in the balance, with Ayanna caught in the middle of forces much larger than herself, unaware that this moment would change the course of her entire life. The silence stretched like a taut rope ready to snap. Every person in the general store seemed frozen in place, afraid to move or speak, and somehow make the situation worse. The 3 Apache warriors stood like statues carved from stone, their presence filling the small space with an energy that made the air itself feel heavy. Morrison's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no words came out. His earlier confidence had evaporated completely under the steady gaze of the Apache chief. The other customers began to slowly back away, sensing that violence might explode at any moment. The Apache leader took a single step forward, his moccasined feet silent on the wooden floor. "I asked you a question," he said to Morrison, his voice still quiet but carrying an undertone of steel. "Were you about to strike this woman?" I wasn't," Morrison stammered, his earlier bravado completely gone. "We were just having a conversation." "A conversation," the chief repeated, his dark eyes never leaving Morrison's face. "Is that what you call it when a grown man towers over a young woman and raises his hand to her?" One of the other Apache warriors, a younger man with fierce eyes and numerous scars marking his arms, spoke in their native language. His tone suggested he was asking for permission to do something violent. The chief responded in the same language, his words firm but controlled. Ayanna, still crouched near the scattered supplies, found herself staring at these men who had appeared like spirits from another world. She had heard stories about the Apache, tales of their fierce fighting ability, and their refusal to be broken by the white man's attempts to control them. But she had never seen Apache warriors up close, and certainly never imagined they would intervene in her troubles. The chief turned his attention to her, his expression softening slightly. "Are you hurt?" he asked in English. Ayanna shook her head, not trusting her voice to work properly. The kindness in his voice was so unexpected after Morrison's cruelty that it almost brought tears to her eyes. "Stand up," the chief said gently. "No one should have to cower on the ground." With trembling legs, Ayanna rose to her feet. The spilled flour had left white marks on her dark dress, and her hands were shaking from the confrontation. She kept her eyes down, unsure what to do or say in this unprecedented situation. The chief studied her face carefully, taking in her features and the obvious signs of her mixed heritage. "What is your name?" he asked. "Ayanna Whitehorse," she said quietly. "Whitehorse," the chief repeated thoughtfully. "Cherokee. My father was Cherokee," she confirmed. "My mother was white." The chief nodded slowly. "I knew some of the Whitehorse clan. Good people, warriors and peacemakers both." He paused, then added, "My name is Nailnish. These are my companions, Bidzeal and Hastian." The introductions seemed to break some of the tension in the room, though Morrison and his friends still looked ready to bolt for the door at the first opportunity. Edmund Thornfield stepped forward carefully, clearly trying to defuse the situation before it escalated further. "Gentlemen," he said to the Apache warriors, "I appreciate your intervention, but I believe we can handle this matter internally. Jake here was just leaving, weren't you, Jake?" Morrison nodded eagerly, grateful for the escape route. "Yeah, I was just heading out. No trouble here." But Nailnish wasn't ready to let him go so easily. "Wait," he said, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a man used to being obeyed. "I think you owe this woman an apology." Morrison's face went red again. "Apologize? To her?" Unless you prefer to discuss your behavior in a different way, Nailnish said calmly. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Thornfield looked nervous. Now, let's not make this more complicated than it needs to be, he said. Jake, just apologize and we can all move on. Morrison glanced around the room, seeing no support from anyone. Even his friends were looking at him with expressions that clearly said they wanted no part of a fight with Apache warriors. Swallowing his pride like bitter medicine, he mumbled, sorry. Louder, Nailnish commanded. And look at her when you say it. Morrison raised his eyes to meet Ayana's gaze, his face burning with humiliation. I'm sorry, he said, the words coming out strangled and reluctant. Ayana nodded slightly, accepting the apology even though she knew it was meaningless. Morrison didn't mean a word of it, and, given the chance, he would probably treat her even worse in the future. Now you can go, Nailnish said dismissively. Morrison and his friends practically ran from the store, leaving behind an atmosphere of stunned silence. The other customers began to disperse as well, some stopping to help Ayana gather up her scattered purchases, others simply wanting to escape the tension. Nailnish watched Morrison leave, then turned back to Ayana. This happens to you often? He asked. Ayana shrugged, trying to minimize the situation. Sometimes. People don't always appreciate mixed blood. Their ignorance is not your burden to bear, Nailnish said firmly. You carry the blood of two peoples. That should be seen as strength, not weakness. The words were unlike anything Ayana had ever heard before. Throughout her life, her mixed heritage had been presented as something shameful, an accident of nature that marked her as lesser than either race. To hear it described as strength was revolutionary. I never thought of it that way, she admitted. Perhaps you should start, Nailnish suggested. He studied her carefully, then asked, You work for this man? He nodded toward Thornfield. Yes, sir, Ayana replied. I'm employed by the Thornfield household. Thornfield stepped forward again, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. Ayana is a valued employee, he said. She's well treated and well compensated for her work. Nailnish's eyes flicked to Thornfield, and something in his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Is that so? He asked Ayana directly. The question put Ayana in an impossible position. She couldn't complain about her treatment in front of her employer, but she also sensed that lying to this Apache chief would be dangerous. She settled for a diplomatic response. Mr. Thornfield provides me with work and shelter, she said carefully. That's not what I asked, Nailnish observed. But I understand your position. He turned to his companions and spoke in Apache for several minutes. The younger warrior, Bidziel, seemed to be arguing about something, his voice rising with passion. Hastian, the third member of their group, appeared to be supporting whatever point Nailnish was making. The conversation was intense, but controlled, clearly addressing some significant issue. While they talked, Ayana finished gathering the salvageable supplies. Mr. Hansen, the storekeeper, had been quietly replacing the items that had been ruined, refusing to charge her for Morrison's destruction. It was a small kindness that meant more than he probably realized. Dr. Williams approached her as she worked. Are you all right, my dear? He asked quietly. That was quite an ordeal. I'm fine, Dr. Williams, Ayana assured him. Thank you for speaking up earlier. I should have done more, the doctor said, his face troubled. No one should have to endure that kind of treatment. It's not your responsibility to fight my battles, Ayana said, though she appreciated his concern. Perhaps not, but it's everyone's responsibility to stand against cruelty and injustice, Dr. Williams replied. I'll do better next time. The Apache warriors finished their discussion, and Nailnish approached Ayana again. We are traveling through this territory on our way to negotiate with the territorial government about water rights, he explained. We will be in the area for several days. I see, Ayana said, though she wasn't sure why he was telling her this. If you have more trouble with that man, or anyone like him, you can find us camped in the hills north of town, near the old trading post ruins, Nailnish continued. We do not abandon those who share native blood when they are threatened. The offer was both touching and dangerous. Accepting help from Apache warriors would certainly mark Ayana as a troublemaker in the eyes of the white community. But after what had just happened, she was beginning to realize that her position in that community was already more precarious than she had thought. Thank you, she said sincerely. That's very kind. It is not kindness, Nailnish corrected her. It is duty. We protect our own. The The simple words sent a warmth through Ayana's chest that she hadn't felt in years. For so long, she had felt utterly alone in the world, caught between two peoples and claimed by neither. To hear someone say our own and include her in that category was overwhelming. Thornfield had been watching this exchange with growing concern. Ayana, he said firmly, it's time to return to the house. Mrs. Thornfield is expecting these supplies. Of course, Mr. Thornfield, Ayana said, gathering up her basket of purchases. But, as she turned to leave, Nailnish spoke again. Remember what I told you about strength, he said. And remember where to find us if you need help. The walk back to the Thornfield mansion was awkward and tense. Thornfield said nothing, but Ayana could feel his displeasure radiating from him like heat from a fire. She knew that her interaction with the Apache warriors had complicated her already difficult position, but she couldn't bring herself to regret their intervention. When they reached the house, Margaret Thornfield was waiting on the front porch, her arms crossed, and her expression stormy. She had clearly heard about the incident in town. News traveled fast in a small community, especially when it involved Apache warriors and public confrontations. So, Margaret said coldly as Ayana approached, I hear you caused quite a scene in town today. I didn't cause anything, ma'am, Ayana said quietly. I was just trying to buy the supplies you requested. Don't lie to me, girl, Margaret snapped. People don't get into fights with respectable men like Jake Morrison unless they're asking for trouble. Ayana bit back her response. Jake Morrison was many things, but respectable wasn't one of them. However, contradicting her employer's wife would only make things worse. Tell me exactly what happened, Margaret demanded. Ayana recounted the events in the store, leaving out her emotional reactions but sticking to the facts. As she talked, Margaret's expression grew increasingly disapproving. And then these Apache savages just happened to show up at the perfect moment. Margaret said skeptically, How convenient. It was a coincidence, ma'am, Ayana said. I had never seen them before. Margaret mused. Well, regardless of how it happened, you've now associated this household with Apache troublemakers. Do you have any idea how damaging that could be to our reputation? Edmund stepped forward. Margaret, the girl was being harassed. She didn't ask for help. It was offered. That's not the point, Edmund, Margaret replied sharply. The point is that decent people will now associate our name with Indian violence and disorder. We'll be lucky if we're still invited to social functions after this scandal. Ayana felt her heart sinking. She had known there would be consequences for what had happened, but she hadn't fully considered how it might affect the Thornfields. Despite their flaws, they had given her employment and shelter when she desperately needed both. I'm sorry, ma'am, she said. I never intended to cause problems for your family. Well, you have, Margaret said coldly. And now I need to figure out what to do about it. The threat in her voice was clear. Ayana's position in the household had always been tenuous, dependent on the Thornfields' goodwill and their need for cheap labor. If Margaret decided she was more trouble than she was worth, Ayana would find herself without work or shelter. Forced to survive, however, she could in a town that had just seen her publicly defended by Apache warriors. Perhaps we should discuss this privately, Edmund suggested, glancing meaningfully at his wife. Margaret nodded curtly. Ayana, go to your room. Don't come out until you're called for. And don't speak to anyone about what happened today. Yes, ma'am, Ayana said, though she wondered who she might speak to even if she wanted to. She had no friends in town, no family to turn to, and now her employment was in jeopardy. As she made her way to the small servants' quarters behind the main house, Ayana could hear the Thornfields beginning to argue in hushed tones on the porch. She caught fragments of their conversation, words like reputation, scandal, and liability that made her stomach clench with anxiety. Her room was tiny, barely large enough for a narrow bed, a small dresser, and a washstand. The single window faced the hills where Nailnish had said the Apache warriors were camped. As darkness fell, she found herself staring out that window, wondering what would happen to her now. The events of the day replayed in her mind like scenes from a dream. Morrison's cruelty, the scattered supplies, the sudden appearance of the Apache warriors, and, most of all, Nailnish's words about strength and protection. No one had ever offered to protect her before. The very idea seemed too good to be true. But, as she lay on her narrow bed, listening to the voices from the main house growing louder and more heated, Ayana began to suspect that she might need that protection sooner than she had thought. The confrontation with Morrison was just the beginning. Her association with Apache warriors, however unintentional, had marked her as dangerous in the eyes of the white community. And in a town like Silver Creek, being marked as dangerous, it could be a death sentence for a half-Cherokee girl with no family and no powerful friends to protect her. Everything in her life was about to change, and she wasn't sure she was strong enough to survive what was coming. Outside her window, a coyote howled in the distance, and the sound seemed to carry both warning and promise on the desert wind. The next 3 days passed like a storm cloud gathering strength. Ayanna could feel the tension building in the Thornfield household with each passing hour. Margaret's disapproval had crystallized into open hostility, while Edmund seemed torn between pragmatic concern and what appeared to be a genuine sense of fairness. The other servants, particularly Mary O'Brien, the Irish cook, began treating Ayanna with a mixture of pity and fear, as if her troubles might somehow contaminate them. Word of the incident in the general store had spread through Silver Creek like wildfire, growing and changing with each telling. By the time the story made its rounds through the saloons, church meetings, and sewing circles, Ayanna had been transformed from a victim of harassment into a troublemaker who had somehow summoned Apache warriors to threaten decent white folks. The truth, as usual, had been buried beneath layers of prejudice and fear. On the fourth morning after the confrontation, Margaret Thornfield finally made her decision. She summoned Ayanna to the main parlor, a room the servant had only entered to clean and dust. The formal setting made it clear that this was not going to be a casual conversation. Margaret sat in her favorite high-back chair, dressed in her best morning gown as if she were receiving important guests. Her pale hands were folded in her lap, and her expression was cold and resolved. Edmund stood near the window, his back to the room, suggesting that he either disagreed with what was about to happen or simply couldn't bear to watch it. Ayanna, Margaret began without preamble, I've given considerable thought to your situation, and I've reached a decision. Ayanna's heart began to pound, but she kept her voice steady. Yes, ma'am. Your association with those Apache criminals has made your position in this household untenable, Margaret continued. Respectable people in this community are beginning to question our judgment in employing someone who consorts with savages. I don't consort with anyone, ma'am, Ayanna said quietly. I was simply the victim of harassment, and they happened to intervene. Margaret's eyes flashed with anger. Don't interrupt me, girl, and don't try to justify your behavior. She took a deep breath, clearly enjoying the moment of absolute power. As I was saying, your presence here has become a liability. Therefore, I am terminating your employment, effective immediately. The words hit Ayanna like a physical blow, even though she had been expecting them. Mrs. Thornfield, please reconsider. I've worked faithfully for your family for 3 years. I've never caused any trouble before this. Never caused trouble? Margaret laughed harshly. You exist, girl. Your very presence in a decent Christian household is trouble. I should have listened to my instincts when Edmund first suggested hiring you. Edmund turned from the window, his face flushed with embarrassment. Margaret, that's enough. There's no need to be cruel. Cruel? Margaret turned her cold gaze on her husband. I'm being practical. This family has a reputation to maintain in this community. We can't afford to be associated with Indian violence. There was no Indian violence, Edmund protested. The Apache warriors prevented violence, if anything. The details don't matter, Margaret snapped. What matters is perception. And the perception is that we employ someone who brings chaos and danger to our peaceful community. Ayanna felt tears threatening, but she refused to let them fall in front of Margaret Thornfield. What am I supposed to do? Where am I supposed to go? Margaret shrugged with calculated indifference. That's not my concern. You should have considered the consequences of your actions before you decided to make friends with savage warriors. She didn't make friends with anyone, Edmund said, his voice rising with frustration. She was being assaulted by a drunk, and strangers intervened to help her. Would you prefer that she had been beaten? I would prefer that she had conducted herself in a manner that wouldn't have attracted attention in the first place, Margaret replied icily. The injustice of the statement took Ayanna's breath away. She was being blamed for existing, for being the target of someone else's hatred, for being rescued when she might otherwise have been seriously hurt. The complete lack of logic in Margaret's position made it clear that this was about more than the incident with Morrison. You'll be paid through the end of the week, Margaret continued, which is more generosity than you deserve. I expect you to be off the property by sunset. Today, Ayanna asked, struggling to process the timeline. Today, Margaret confirmed with satisfaction. I won't spend another night under the same roof as someone who associates with Apache terrorists. They weren't terrorists, Ayanna said, finally, allowing some of her anger to show through. They were just men who saw someone being mistreated and decided to help. Margaret's face went white with rage. How dare you defend those savages in my house? Get out. Get out now, before I have my husband fetch the sheriff to remove you. Edmund looked mortified by his wife's behavior, but he made no move to contradict her orders. Ayanna realized that whatever sympathy he might feel for her situation, it wasn't strong enough to create a permanent rift with his wife. I'll get my things, Ayanna said with as much dignity as she could manage. You have 10 minutes, Margaret called after her as she left the parlor. Ayanna's possessions fit easily into a single canvas bag. 3 years of working for the Thornfields had left her with little to show for her labor beyond a few changes of clothes, some personal items that had belonged to her parents, and a small amount of saved money that she kept hidden in the lining of her winter coat. As she packed, Mary O'Brien appeared in the doorway of the tiny room. The Irish woman's face was filled with sympathy and genuine regret. I'm sorry, lass, Mary said quietly. This is wrong, and everyone knows it. Thank you, Mary, Ayanna replied. You've been kind to me. Where will you go? Mary asked, glancing nervously toward the main house to make sure they weren't being overheard. I don't know, Ayanna admitted. Maybe I can find work at one of the other ranches. Mary's expression suggested she knew how unlikely that was. Word of Ayanna's dismissal would spread just as quickly as word of the original incident had. Any potential employer would think twice about hiring someone who had been fired for associating with Apache warriors. Here, Mary said, pressing a small package wrapped in brown paper into Ayanna's hands. Some food for your journey. And there's a little money in there, too. Just a few dollars I could spare. Ayanna's throat tightened with emotion. Mary had very little money herself, sending most of her wages back to relatives in Ireland. The gift represented a real sacrifice. I can't take this, Ayanna protested. You can and you will, Mary said firmly. We women have to look out for each other, especially when the men won't do what's right. Before Ayanna could respond, Margaret's voice echoed from the main house, calling impatiently for her to hurry up. Mary squeezed Ayanna's hand once and disappeared back toward the kitchen. Ayanna finished packing and took a last look around the small room that had been her home for 3 years. It hadn't been much, but it had been hers, and it had been safe. Now she was being thrust back into a world that had made it clear she wasn't welcome. She carried her bag to the front of the house, where Margaret waited with obvious impatience. Edmund was nowhere to be seen, probably having retreated to avoid witnessing the final moments of Ayanna's humiliation. Your final wages, Margaret said, holding out a small envelope without making any effort to place it directly in Ayanna's hands. Ayanna took the envelope and tucked it into her coat pocket without counting the contents. She knew Margaret well enough to be certain that every penny would be accounted for, with nothing extra included. I suppose you'll be running straight to your Apache friends now, Margaret said with a sneer. Birds of a feather, as they say. I haven't decided where I'm going, Ayanna replied truthfully. Well, wherever it is, don't come back here looking for charity, Margaret warned. You've made your choices, and now you'll live with the consequences. Without another word, Ayanna turned and walked away from the Thornfield mansion. She could feel Margaret's eyes on her back until she reached the main road, but she refused to look back or give the woman the satisfaction of seeing her break down. The afternoon sun was brutal, beating down on the dusty road that led back toward Silver Creek. Ayanna had nowhere to go in town, no friends to take her in, no family to offer shelter. Her only option was to seek employment at one of the smaller ranches in the area, though she suspected that word of her dismissal had already reached most of the potential employers. As she walked, she found herself thinking about Nailnish's offer of protection. The Apache camp was in the hills north of town, he had said, near the old trading post ruins. But accepting help from the Apache would mark her as a traitor to the white community and eliminate any chance she might have of finding work in the territory. On the other hand, she was beginning to wonder if she had any real chance anyway. The incident with Morrison had revealed the depths of hostility that many people felt toward her simply because of her mixed heritage. She had been fooling herself to think that quiet behavior and hard work would be enough to secure her a place in white society. The sound of approaching horses made her step to the side of the road. A group of riders was coming from the direction of town, moving fast and kicking up clouds of dust. As they drew closer, Ayana's heart sank. Jake Morrison was leading the group, and his companions included several other young men she recognized as troublemakers and drunks. She considered running into the brush beside the road, but there was no real cover nearby, and running would only confirm their suspicions that she was up to something wrong. Instead, she kept walking, hoping they would simply ride past. But Morrison had spotted her, and he reined in his horse directly in front of her, forcing her to stop. The other riders formed a loose circle around her, effectively trapping her on the open road. Well, Morrison said, his voice thick with malicious satisfaction. Look what we have here. The half-breed's been thrown out of her fancy house. News travels fast, one of his companions observed with a laugh. Good news always does, Morrison replied. Bad news about decent white folks getting mixed up with Indian troublemakers travels even faster. Ayana tried to step around Morrison's horse, but he moved to block her path again. I'm just passing through, she said calmly. I don't want any trouble. Too bad, Morrison said, because trouble seems to follow you around like a bad smell. The men around her laughed, clearly enjoying the entertainment. Ayana realized that this confrontation was no accident. Morrison and his friends had been waiting for her to leave the Thornfield property, probably planning this encounter since they learned of her dismissal. Where are you headed, Breed? Morrison asked. Back to your Apache friends? I'm looking for work, Ayana said, though she knew the admission made her sound desperate. Work? Morrison laughed harshly. Who's going to hire an Indian lover? You burned that bridge when you brought those savages into town. I didn't bring anyone anywhere, Ayana protested. They came on their own business. Sure they did, Morrison said sarcastically. Just happened to show up right when you needed rescuing. Pure coincidencia. One of the other men, a thin fellow with bad teeth and worse hygiene, spoke up. Maybe she sent them some kind of signal. Indians have all sorts of secret ways of communicating. The suggestion was absurd, but the other men nodded as if it made perfect sense. Ayana realized that they had convinced themselves of a conspiracy that existed only in their prejudiced minds. I think maybe we need to search her, Morrison said thoughtfully. Make sure she's not carrying messages back to her Apache friends. You have no right to search me, Ayana said, backing away from Morrison's horse. I haven't broken any laws. Laws? Morrison laughed. Who's going to enforce laws way out here? Sheriff's back in town, and we're just concerned citizens making sure there are no Indian spies operating in our territory. The men began to dismount, their intentions becoming clearer and more dangerous. Ayana looked around desperately, but the road was empty in both directions. The nearest ranch was miles away, and screaming would accomplish nothing except to alert any other travelers that something was happening. Please, she said, hating the pleading note in her voice, but seeing no alternative. I'm just a woman trying to find work. I'm not a threat to anyone. That's where you're wrong, Morrison said, stepping closer to her. You're exactly the kind of threat we need to eliminate. Mixed-blood troublemakers who bring Apache warriors into our peaceful community. He reached out to grab her arm, just as he had in the general store. But this time, there was no Edmund Thornfield to intervene, no Dr. Williams to speak up for her, and certainly no Apache warriors to appear at the crucial moment. Ayana jerked away from Morrison's grasp and stumbled backward, her feet tangling in her long skirt. She fell hard, scraping her hands on the rocky ground and tearing her dress. The men laughed at her clumsiness, clearly enjoying her helplessness. Look at that, Morrison said mockingly. Can't even keep her feet under her. No wonder she needs Apache warriors to fight her battles. As Ayana struggled to get back to her feet, Morrison stepped on her skirt, pinning her to the ground. The other men moved closer, forming a tight circle that blocked out the sun and made the afternoon seem suddenly darker. Now then, Morrison said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. Let's have a little conversation about your Apache friends and what messages you might be carrying. But before he could continue his threat, the sound of galloping horses echoed across the desert. A new group of riders was approaching fast, coming from the direction of the hills where the Apache warriors were camped. Morrison and his men turned toward the sound, their confidence wavering as they realized they might not be alone with their victim after all. And as the riders drew closer, Ayana felt a surge of hope mixed with terror because she recognized the lead horse and its rider. Nailnish had come, just as he had promised he would. The thundering of hooves grew louder as three riders crested the hill and galloped down toward the confrontation on the dusty road. Nailnish rode in the lead, his powerful horse moving like liquid lightning across the uneven terrain. Behind him came Bidzeal and Hastian, their faces grim and their hands resting casually but meaningfully on their weapons. Morrison's men instinctively moved closer together, their earlier bravado evaporating as they faced the prospect of a real fight with experienced warriors. These weren't drunk cowboys in a saloon or helpless women they could intimidate with impunity. These were Apache fighters who had survived decades of warfare against the United States Army. "Let her up," Nailnish commanded as he reined in his horse just yards away from the group. His voice carried the absolute authority of a man who expected to be obeyed without question. Morrison's foot was still pinning Ayana's skirt to the ground, but his leg began to tremble. "This is none of your concern, Indian," he said, though his voice lacked the conviction it had held just moments before. "I told you once before that everything in Apache territory is our concern," Nailnish replied calmly. "And I specifically remember telling you that threatening defenseless women makes you either a coward or a bully." "She's not defenseless," one of Morrison's companions said nervously. "She's got you Indians protecting her." Nailnish's gaze shifted to the man who had spoken, studying him with the intensity of a predator evaluating potential prey. "I see 6 armed men surrounding one woman on the ground," he observed. "If that seems like a fair fight to you, then perhaps you should reconsider your understanding of courage." Bidzeal, the younger Apache warrior, spoke in rapid, angry phrases in their native language. His horse danced restlessly beneath him, and his hand moved closer to the rifle across his saddle. Nailnish responded with a few quiet words that seemed to calm him slightly, but the tension in the younger man's posture suggested he was eager for action. "I'm going to say this once more," Nailnish continued in English, his tone remaining conversational, but somehow becoming more menacing. "Let the woman stand up, get on your horses, and ride away. Do it now, and we'll consider this a misunderstanding between travelers." Morrison looked around at his companions, seeing fear and uncertainty in their faces. The odds were still technically in their favor, 6 against 3, but Apache warriors were legendary for their fighting skills. More importantly, this confrontation was taking place in the middle of nowhere, with no witnesses and no law enforcement nearby. If shooting started, there would be no one left alive to tell the white community's version of events. But Morrison's pride and hatred ran deeper than his common sense. He had been humiliated in front of the entire town just days before, and now the same Indians were threatening to humiliate him again. The thought of backing down twice to the same opponents was more than his damaged ego could bear. "I don't take orders from savages," he said, pressing his foot down harder on Ayana's skirt. "This woman is suspected of carrying messages to enemy warriors. That makes her a spy, and spies get interrogated." The accusation was so absurd that for a moment no one responded. Then, Hastian, who had remained silent until now, began to laugh, a sound completely devoid of humor that sent chills down the spines of Morrison's men. "A spy?" Hastian repeated in accented but clear English. "This woman who has nowhere to go and no one to protect her is your idea of a dangerous spy. She's been working in a white household for 3 years," Morrison said defensively. "She could have been gathering information the whole time." "Information about what?" Nailnish asked with genuine curiosity. "Mrs. Thornfield's recipe for biscuits? The best way to remove stains from laundry." The ridiculous nature of the accusation was becoming clear even to Morrison's supporters. Cowboys and ranch hands weren't military strategists, but they understood that household servants rarely had access to information valuable enough to justify elaborate spy networks. "You don't know what she might have learned," Morrison insisted stubbornly. "What I know," Nailnish said, his patience clearly wearing thin, "is that you have about 10 seconds to decide whether you want to continue this conversation with words or with weapons." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a campfire, acrid and impossible to ignore. Morrison's men began to edge away from their leader, suddenly realizing that their loyalty only extended so far. Getting killed over Jake Morrison's wounded pride wasn't high on anyone's list of priorities, but Morrison himself seemed incapable of backing down. The combination of alcohol, humiliation, and ingrained prejudice had created a toxic mixture that clouded his judgment. "You threatening us?" he asked belligerently. "I'm offering you a choice," Nailnish corrected. "A choice you probably won't get again." Morrison looked down at Ayanna, still trapped beneath his foot, then back at the three Apache warriors. For a moment, it seemed like reason might prevail. Then, his gaze fell on the small crowd of his supporters, and he made the worst possible decision. "Boys," he said loudly, "I think these Indians need to learn some respect for white authority." The reaction was immediate and telling. Three of Morrison's 6 companions immediately began backing toward their horses, clearly having no interest in a gunfight with Apache warriors. A fourth man actually mounted his horse and began riding away without a word. Only 2 men remained standing with Morrison, and they looked like they were seriously reconsidering their life choices. Nailnish sighed, a sound of genuine regret. "I was hoping you would be smarter than this," he said sadly. What happened next took place so quickly that later, when people tried to describe it, they could never quite agree on the sequence of events. Nailnish's horse seemed to leap forward almost before he gave it the command. Morrison, still standing over Ayanna, had barely enough time to register the movement before the Apache chief was on top of him. The collision sent Morrison sprawling backward into the dust, his rifle flying out of his hands and landing several yards away. Before he could even think about reaching for his sidearm, he found himself staring up at the business end of Nailnish's Winchester rifle. Meanwhile, Bidziel and Hastian had moved to handle Morrison's remaining supporters. The 2 men who had stayed with their leaders suddenly found themselves facing experienced warriors who moved with the fluid grace of predators. Within moments, both cowboys were on the ground, disarmed and thoroughly subdued. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds. Ayanna scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding from the sudden violence and equally sudden resolution. She brushed the dust from her torn dress and tried to process what had just happened. 3 Apache warriors had just defeated 6 armed white men without firing a single shot or inflicting any serious injuries. Nailnish dismounted and walked over to where Morrison lay gasping in the dirt. "I gave you multiple opportunities to leave peacefully," he said conversationally. "You chose violence instead. That was your decision." Morrison tried to speak, but could only wheeze. The wind had been knocked out of him when Nailnish's horse slammed into his chest, and he was struggling to breathe normally. "Now," Nailnish continued, "you're going to listen very carefully to what I tell you, because your life depends on understanding this message completely." He knelt down next to Morrison, bringing his face close enough that the terrified man could see every detail of the Apache warrior's expression. "This woman is under my protection now," Nailnish said quietly. "That means if anyone harms her, threatens her, or even speaks to her disrespectfully, they will answer to me personally." Morrison's eyes widened with fear and understanding. "I want you to spread that message to everyone in your pathetic little town," Nailnish continued. "Tell them that Nailnish of the Chiricahua Apache has claimed Ayanna Whitehorse as protected family. Tell them that anyone who troubles her will face consequences that will make their worst nightmares seem like pleasant dreams." The promise was delivered in such a calm, matter-of-fact tone that it was somehow more terrifying than any amount of shouting or threats would have been. Morrison nodded frantically, eager to show that he understood and accepted the terms being offered. Nailnish stood up and looked around at the scattered weapons and defeated men. "Hastian," he called in English, "gather their guns." The older Apache warrior quickly collected the rifles and pistols that had been dropped during the brief fight. He carried them to a nearby boulder and began smashing them methodically with his own rifle, but rendering them useless. "Your weapons are forfeit," Nailnish explained to Morrison and his men. "The price of threatening protected family. You can walk back to town and explain to people how you lost an entire arsenal to 3 Apache warriors. The humiliation of returning to Silver Creek unarmed and on foot would be almost as devastating to Morrison's reputation as the physical defeat had been to his body. But he was in no position to protest, and he was beginning to understand that he was lucky to be alive. "Can you walk?" Nailnish asked Morrison, who was still lying on the ground. Morrison managed to sit up, testing his limbs for serious damage. Everything hurt, but nothing seemed to be broken. "Yeah," he gasped. "I think so." "Good," Nailnish said. "Then start walking. All of you." And remember what I told you about spreading the word. Morrison's surviving supporters didn't need to be told twice. They helped their leader to his feet and began the long, hot walk back to Silver Creek, leaving behind their broken weapons and what remained of their pride. As the defeated men disappeared down the road, Nailnish turned his attention to Ayanna. She was standing uncertainly near her dropped traveling bag, clearly overwhelmed by everything that had happened. "Are you hurt?" he asked gently. Ayanna shook her head, though her scraped hands were bleeding slightly from when she had fallen. "I'm fine," she said, then added quietly, "Thank you." "You shouldn't have to thank anyone for preventing you from being assaulted," Nailnish replied. "But you're welcome." Bidzeal and Hastian had finished destroying the weapons, and were preparing to mount their horses again. They spoke briefly with Nailnish and Apache, their tone suggesting they were discussing plans or strategies. "What will you do now?" Nailnish asked Ayanna. The question brought her back to the reality of her situation. She was homeless, unemployed, and had just been publicly claimed as protected family by an Apache chief. Her options in the white community had been limited before. Now, they were practically non-existent. "I don't know," she admitted. "I was hoping to find work at one of the ranches, but after what just happened, no white employer will touch you," Nailnish said bluntly. "They'll see you as too dangerous to hire." The words stung because they were true. Ayanna had been clinging to the hope that she could somehow rebuild her life within the white community, but that hope was clearly unrealistic now. "Come with us," Nailnish said simply. The invitation was so unexpected that Ayanna wasn't sure she had heard correctly. "What?" "Come with us to our camp," Nailnish repeated. "You need shelter and protection. We can provide both." "I can't," Ayanna said automatically. "I mean, I appreciate the offer, but I can't just leave everything behind and live with Apache warriors." "What exactly would you be leaving behind?" Nailnish asked pointedly. "A job you've already lost? A home you've already been thrown out of? Friends who abandoned you the moment you needed them?" The questions hit home with painful accuracy. What did she really have to lose? Her entire life in the white community had just collapsed, and the prospects for rebuilding it were minimal at best. "But I don't know anything about Apache ways," Ayanna protested. "I wouldn't know how to live in your world." "You'll learn," Nailnish said confidently, "and you'll be surprised how much Cherokee wisdom carries over to Apache traditions. Your father's people and mine have always understood each other better than either group understands the whites." It was a momentous decision, and Ayanna felt the weight of it pressing down on her like a physical force. She was being offered a chance to walk away from the white world entirely and embrace the native heritage she had always been made to feel ashamed of. But making that choice would mean crossing a bridge that could never be recrossed. "Take your time," Nailnish said, seeming to understand her internal struggle. "But don't take too long. The sun is getting low, and we should reach camp before dark." As if summoned by his words, a hot wind swept across the desert, carrying with it the scents of sage and distant rain. For the first time in years, Ayanna allowed herself to imagine a different kind of life, one where her mixed heritage might be seen as strength rather than weakness, where she might find people who would accept her as family rather than tolerate her as hired help. She looked down the empty road toward Silver Creek, then back at the 3 Apache warriors who waited patiently for her decision. The choice, when it finally came to her, felt as inevitable as sunrise. The Apache camp was unlike anything Ayanna had ever seen before. Nestled in a hidden valley between rocky hills, it seemed to emerge from the landscape itself rather than impose upon it. Traditional wickiups made of bent willow branches and covered with hide and brush dotted the area, practically invisible from any distance. Cooking fires sent thin streams of smoke into the evening air, and the sounds of children playing mixed with the gentle conversation of women preparing the evening meal. As they rode into camp, Ayanna felt dozens of eyes upon her. The Apache people stopped their activities to watch the arrival of the strange woman with Nailnish and his companions. She could see curiosity in their faces, but not the hostility she had grown accustomed to in the white community. These people seemed more interested than judgmental. Nailnish dismounted near the largest wickiup and helped Ayanna down from the horse she had been riding behind Bidzeal. Her legs were shaky from the long ride and the emotional upheaval of the day. Everything that had happened since morning seemed like a dream, or perhaps a nightmare from which she might wake up at any moment. An elderly woman emerged from the large wickiup, moving with the careful grace of someone whose joints have been stiffened by decades of hard work and harsh weather. Her hair was completely white and braided with small ornaments that caught the firelight. Her face was deeply lined, but carried an expression of intelligence and warmth that immediately put Ayana at ease. The woman spoke to Nailnish in rapid Apache, her tone suggesting she was asking questions rather than making accusations. Nailnish responded at length, clearly explaining the day's events and his decision to bring Ayana to the camp. Other members of the group gathered around to listen, their faces reflecting various degrees of interest and concern. "This is my mother, Desba," Nailnish said to Ayana in English. "She wants to know if you're hungry." The simple question almost brought tears to Ayana's eyes. After a day of being called a spy, a troublemaker, and worse, being asked about something as basic as hunger felt like a return to normal human interaction. "Yes," Ayana admitted. "I haven't eaten since morning." Desba nodded and spoke again to her son, then gestured for Ayana to follow her. As they walked toward one of the cooking fires, the older woman spoke in heavily accented but clear English. "You are welcome here," she said simply. "My son does not bring people to our camp lightly. If he has offered you protection, then you are family." The concept of instant family was foreign to Ayana, who had spent years feeling like an outsider everywhere she went. "I don't want to be a burden," she said. Desba stopped walking and studied Ayana's face carefully. "Do you know what burden means to our people?" she asked. "No, ma'am. Burden is when someone takes without giving, when they consume without contributing," Desba explained. "But you have skills, yes? You have worked in white houses, learned their ways." "Yes, I worked as a maid and helper for 3 years." "Then you will contribute," Desba said matter-of-factly. "You will share what you know, learn what we know, and become part of the circle. That is not burden, that is balance." They reached the cooking fire, where several women were preparing what smelled like roasted meat and corn cakes. The women looked up curiously as Desba approached with a newcomer, and rapid conversations in Apache followed. Ayana caught her own name mentioned several times, along with words that sounded like questions. One of the younger women, perhaps close to Ayana's own age, stepped forward with a bowl of food and a friendly smile. "I am Shitsa," she said in careful English. "Nailnish is my cousin. You are safe here." The food was simple but delicious. Venison seasoned with wild herbs, corn cakes sweetened with honey, and a drink made from berries that Ayana didn't recognize. As she ate, more people gathered around the fire, curious about the newcomer but respectful of her obvious exhaustion. Children peeked around their mothers' skirts to get a look at the woman with the unusual background. Unlike the adults, they seemed completely untroubled by questions of heritage or belonging. To them, she was simply a new person to observe and potentially befriend. "The children want to know if you speak Cherokee," Shitsa explained with amusement. "They have heard stories about the Cherokee people, but never met one." "My father taught me some words," Ayana said, "but I'm not fluent. He died when I was young." This information sparked another round of discussions among the adults. Ayana was beginning to understand that her arrival had created something more significant than simple curiosity. These people were evaluating her not just as an individual, but as a potential addition to their community. As the evening progressed, Nailnish joined the group around the fire. He had changed from his travel clothes into more traditional Apache garments, and his presence seemed to settle some unspoken questions about Ayana's status in the camp. "Tomorrow we will hold council," he announced to the assembled group. "We will discuss our negotiations with the territorial government and plan our next moves." Several of the men nodded seriously. Ayana realized that this wasn't just a random camp of Apache warriors, but some kind of diplomatic mission. The implications of her presence here were far more complex than she had initially understood. "What kind of negotiations?" she asked carefully. "Water rights," Nailnish explained. "The territorial government wants to divert streams that have provided water for our people for generations. They claim the water is needed for new settlements and mining operations. And you're trying to negotiate a compromise?" Nailnish's expression grew grim. "We're trying to prevent our people from dying of thirst. Whether the white government considers that a compromise remains to be seen." The seriousness of the situation began to dawn on Ayana. These weren't raiders or hostile warriors, as many white settlers believed. They were representatives of their people, try to protect their basic survival needs through legal channels. The fact that they had been forced to negotiate for access to water that had always belonged to them demonstrated the impossible position that native peoples found themselves in. "Is there anything I can do to help?" Ayana asked impulsively. The question surprised several people around the fire. Nailnish studied her face carefully, as if trying to determine whether her offer was genuine. "You understand the white world," he said finally. "You've lived among them, worked for them, listened to their conversations. That knowledge could be valuable in negotiations. But I've been cast out of that world," Ayana pointed out. "I'm not sure my knowledge would be current or useful." "Understanding how people think doesn't become obsolete overnight," Desborough observed. "You spent 3 years listening to white people discuss their fears, their hopes, their prejudices. That understanding could help us communicate more effectively." The idea that her painful experiences in the white community might actually be valuable was revolutionary for Ayana. She had always seen her mixed heritage and her position as a servant as sources of weakness and shame. The possibility that they might instead be sources of strength and contribution was overwhelming. As the fire burned lower and people began to drift toward their own dwellings, Shitsa approached Ayana with a bundle of clothes and blankets. "For tonight," she explained. "Tomorrow we will see about making you more permanent arrangements." The casual assumption that Ayana would be staying was both comforting and terrifying. She was being welcomed into a community that operated according to completely different rules from anything she had ever known. The question was whether she could adapt quickly enough to avoid becoming the burden she feared she might be. Shitsa led her to a small wickiup that had apparently been prepared for her use. The shelter was cozy and warm, with sleeping furs laid out on the ground and a small oil lamp providing gentle light. "Sleep well," Shitsa said kindly. "Tomorrow will bring new challenges, but also new possibilities." As Ayana settled into the unfamiliar bedding, she found herself staring up through the smoke hole at the stars overhead. The same stars that had watched over her during those lonely nights in the servants' quarters at the Thornfield mansion. But somehow they seemed brighter here, more welcoming. For the first time in years, she felt genuinely safe. Not just physically protected, but emotionally welcomed. The Apache people had accepted her presence without demanding that she prove her worth or apologize for her existence. The contrast with her treatment in the white community was so stark that it made her wonder why she had spent so long trying to gain acceptance from people who would never see her as fully human. But even as she began to relax into this new sense of belonging, Ayana knew that her story was far from over. The negotiations with the territorial government would undoubtedly be complex and potentially dangerous. Her association with the Apache would make her a permanent exile from white society, with all the risks and limitations that implied. And she still had to prove that she could contribute meaningfully to a community whose ways were largely foreign to her. Yet as sleep finally began to claim her, Ayana felt something she hadn't experienced since her parents' deaths. Hope. Real, genuine hope for a future that might include dignity, respect, and the chance to use her unique background as a source of strength rather than shame. The last thing she heard before drifting off was the soft sound of someone playing a flute somewhere in the camp. The melody, both mournful and jay,